So Petra is a PhD student at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. Her dissertation explores commercial office interior design and architecture seen through the lens of labour process theory. She holds a BA in politics from Oberlin College and an MA in history of design from the V&A/RCA. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much to the Pandemic Perspectives team for having me here today, and thank everyone for staying into the afternoon. It's much appreciated as it's still sunny out here in London, which is great. So over the past year and several odd months of the coronavirus crisis, we've been inundated with news articles and editorials opining the end of the office as we know it. We've been told that with the rise of home working, companies will rapidly shed their physical assets in city and town centers, and that moving forward, even after a return to offices is safe, workers will continue to have the quote unquote freedom to work from home some, if not most or all of the time. In setting out to write this paper, I intended to use the time to explain why I believe so many pundits, journalists, and scholars have been wrong in their predictions for the death of the office post-coronavirus. But of course, in actually writing it, I realized that the answer to this question is lengthy, complicated, and entirely inappropriate for a 15-minute presentation. So instead, I'm going to use my time today to explain how these same pundits, journalists, and scholars have been wrong in their predictions, walking through the concepts and histories which seem to have been overlooked in the formation of so many obituaries for the office. I'll start by giving the briefest possible histories of the space of the office, and then I'll suggest 3 elements which seem to have been overlooked in the rush to make post-pandemic predictions, before concluding with my own thoughts about what the future of the office might hold. So to really understand what's happening with office spaces now and what might happen in the future, we have to start at the beginning, which is the birth of the office. The office as a unique and concrete entity is largely thought to have evolved at the turn of the 20th century. As the scale of business grew, so too did the volume of accompanying paperwork. And with more paperwork came more workers, and thus a need for space in which these individuals could toil. And Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building on the screen now is frequently used as an exemplar of this style of office design. It featured large spaces filled with rows of identical workers sitting in identical chairs that were actually cantilevered from and permanently connected to matching desks. From here, offices alongside the scope of capitalism continued to grow, frequently ever upward, with spaces occupying the vast majority of buildings like the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Plaza. Constructed by available technology, these spaces were fairly narrow and uniform until, as conventional office history wisdom tells us, the middle of the century, when spurred on by the German Bürolandschaft, or office landscaping ideology, office spaces became wider, deeper, less regimented, and more modern. And this era is represented well by iconic buildings such as Mies van der Rohe's Seagram Building, Gordon Bunshaft's Lever House, and Eero Saarinen's Bell Labs, General Motors, and John Deere headquarters. The next waypoint in many histories of the office is Herman Miller's Action Office. Created by Robert Props, Action Office was a modular furniture system designed to facilitate evolution of the workspace and enable more streamlined working practices. And conventional office history tells us that despite the well-intentions of Props and his team, as Action Office hit the market and became popularized, it evolved into perhaps the best known but most disliked office design, the cubicle. And I'm glad we're all using Office Space stills for this because it's great. A familiar cacophony of gray, cubicles took the forms of Action Office and removed any vestiges of flexibility. They permanently divided up office spaces and some would say created maze-like configurations of office floor plans. Office history tells us that as white-collar work became more driven by technology, it became more creative and necessitated more face-to-face contact and also different office designs. And this era is always referred to with an example of Chiat Day's New York headquarters, with virtually no permanent assigned spaces. These offices supposedly began to break down conventional work patterns and in many ways led to the amenity-filled mega office headquarters of today's tech giants like Google, Twitter, and Amazon. And I'll add as an aside that this is not the cafeteria, this is the actual office of Chiat Day. Even more recently, and I'll expand on this in a minute, there's been a steadily growing trend of office hoteling, offices with no assigned or permanent spaces at all. And instead of desks that someone goes to every day, these spaces feature different areas for different kind of work, with workers moving between these areas as needed throughout the day. So with that absolutely incredibly brief history of the office in mind, I want to turn your attention to the present and what I think has gone wrong with so many predictions of the post-coronavirus future of the office. So to start, pundits on office futures seem to treat the coronavirus as a sharp break in the timeline of the office, when I would suggest instead that changes to the office brought about by the pandemic could more accurately be described as an acceleration of changes already taking place. As I've briefly laid out, the office has, over the course of its lifetime, been morphing and changing within some constant parameters in a pretty steady course. The amount of space allocated to each employee has been shrinking, private offices have disappeared. Partitions, providing the barest amount of privacy, have been lowered or eliminated, and even permanent workstations were beginning to evaporate. In short, many Death of the Office articles seem to be basing their predictions on just one snippet of the office's long history, and thus missing out on trends and nuances that might lead to deeper, more accurate understandings of what offices mean now and thus what they might look like in the future. Additionally, I believe that many of the articles written and predictions made regarding the death of the office have been based around a very small, very elite, very white, and very Western sampling of what offices really are. If one looks closely at the predictions for the demise of the office, a pattern seems to emerge. Frequently, although not always, these predictions are based upon the actions of or statements by some of the world's biggest, most advanced, richest corporations: banks, tech giants, law firms, and financial services. And I would suggest that these companies, while large and important, are not necessarily representative of offices and the experience of office workers within the UK, yet alone around the world, and thus should probably not be used as the basis of post-COVID predictions. And even within the narrow examples most frequently cited in the British press, if one was to look a little bit more closely, they would find workers being compelled by these companies to continue working from the office throughout the pandemic. There are engineers maintaining hardware, contractors not provided the same privileges as full-time employees, and janitorial staff and security guards maintaining and patrolling the buildings themselves. So even within this elite, narrow, unrepresentative sample, the decline of the office seems to be overstated. But of course, there are many, many offices other than those of Twitter, Facebook, Barclays, or Deutsche Bank. And many of these workers outside of the most prestigious firms and industries have been working from the office throughout the pandemic. And in Britain, one only has to walk down a high street and peer into the window of an estate agency to see workers toiling away. Receptionists at doctors' offices, emergency call responders, and many others have been compelled to continue working in office spaces throughout the crisis. And this, of course, just touches upon what's happened here in Britain, North Europe, and North America. But the majority of office workers today in the 21st century are not located in our hemisphere. While we may have witnessed bankers, HR administrators, and software engineers in the US and UK, in Germany and France work from home over the past year, we've also seen millions of employees working in call centers in the global South be forced to continue coming into the office despite the pandemic. In addition, offices have continued to be in use in countries which have more successfully contained coronavirus, so Australia, China, Taiwan, and New Zealand. And I bring this up to highlight that the articles we've seen in Britain and the US regarding the future of the office don't actually take into account the majority of offices. And by extrapolating the future of the office based around an incredibly unrepresentative sample, pundits and journalists have painted a lopsided and uninclusive version of the future, one which I think ignores and actually further hides the experiences of most office workers and most office spaces. And finally, I want to suggest that many, if not most, of the death of the office predictions we've seen don't take into account the role which the physical space of the office plays in controlling labor and the labor process. Overall, there seems to be significant hesitance on the part of those writing on the office across the entire spectrum of fields, from journalism and architecture, design management, psychology, facilities management, really you name it, to acknowledge, yet alone investigate, the office as a space built for work, rather than just a space where work happens to take place. But this means that the underlying purpose of the office is frequently ignored, making it easier to imagine and predict a world where these spaces don't exist. But the core purposes of the office do exist and persist for a very particular reason. Just like early factories coalesced to cluster laboring workers under a single roof so they could be more easily monitored and controlled, so did early offices. Office spaces allow management to observe what their employees are doing, yes, but also facilitate control over how workers are getting their work done. And it's important here to remember that the office as we know it is a very explicit product of capitalism. The office doesn't just exist as a space where people come to work, it exists very specifically to facilitate the extraction of labor from workers, and through this, the generation of profit. And this is to say that the space of the physical office serves a key role in what's referred to as the labor process, in how work is undertaken in a capitalist system. Because of this important and arguably very central role, the space of the office can't just go away. If it were to disappear, it would have to be replaced. And while technology to replace the role of the office, to observe the behaviors and control the actions of white-collar workers remotely is certainly developing, and developing in alarmingly dystopian ways, it doesn't seem quite ready yet. And this would suggest that the office still has time left in it. So I think it's only fitting to conclude this paper with a very brief outline of what I think we might see happen to offices over the next few years. I think that for the majority of white-collar workers around the world, very little will change. Offices like call centers will still exist, exerting managerial oversight and authority through their architecture, and workers will still be required to continue coming into these spaces. And I say this not only based on what we've seen in lower paid office spaces throughout the pandemic, but also based on the continued use of office spaces to observe and control workers throughout history, and as I've just mentioned, the fundamental role that space plays in the modern capitalist labor process. However, to give all the journalists credit, I think it is true that some more highly paid workers will be allowed and in fact forced to work from home at least some of the time. And I would bet significant money that despite being forced to work from home, compensation packages will not increase to cover the cost of appropriate workspaces and setups. So in other words, money saved from office closures and downsizing will most likely not be passed on to workers themselves. And at the same time, I believe that the offices these workers used to inhabit and might occasionally come into will change, and change for the worse. Companies will eliminate persistent personal space and move to a more hoteling model while simultaneously reducing the amount of space allocated to each employee. And here I refer to my husband's, unnamed Midwestern tech sector employer, which is in the process of implementing a new, mostly home working system. Workers will be told to work from home for the majority of the time, only coming into the office as needed for teamwork and some meetings. The company will be retaining its prestigious office location, but removing persistent personal space, so workers will be losing their desks. And moving forward, workers will book a station when they want or need to be in the office for the day. So to conclude, I think it's important here to emphasize that, as this has been mentioned several times throughout this conference, that the future of the office is not written in stone, despite what so many critics, politicians, business leaders, academics, and journalists might claim. While there are certainly historical trends and socio-political / economic factors which will pull the trajectory in the office in one way or another, these trends can, with hard work and activism and organizing, be overcome. So instead of something that just is, the post-pandemic future of the office, as with all futures, lies in our collective hands to shape and mold and form. And we're failing in our roles and duties as academics, journalists, historians, and design historians if the way we interact with futures or potential futures leading away from the coronavirus is to just archive or document them. That to live up to our moral and political potential, we have to be willing to engage in evaluating changes and practices, situating these within our historical and social understandings, and simultaneously advocating for the futures that we want to see. So thank you so much for listening. I'll leave you with this great office space GIF, and I look forward to talking with you and answering any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Petra. We love a list of predictions at Pandemic Perspectives as well, so that's very welcomed.